It's just about 5:30, so we'll go ahead and kick this off. I know I got a number of emails over the last couple of days of just family and professional, just last minute things that popped up for people. So we'll go ahead and get started, and then hopefully a couple more people join on. If not, they said they'll watch the video. So hope everyone is having a good first couple days of summer. It is officially summer. So I have the agenda up, although I think like you guys saw last time, I like this to be very conversational. But one of the things I wanted to go over was, I know some people had some questions that popped up last time just from some different data and stuff we can pulled up. So I just wanted to go over a little bit of that. And then also, I mean, what would a Zoom be without a PowerPoint, right? I mean, we cannot do Zooms without PowerPoints. So same type of thing, small groups. This is the first small group of June, so that's really exciting to kind of reconnect after the end of the school year. But also there's a lot going on legislatively too. That's all in the vein of things that we have been discussing. So I'll bring up our summary page in a minute, but I'm going to go ahead and not even follow my slideshow. One of the things I wanted to just like highlight was one question I got in every single group was, what do you think the legislature will actually do? Do they actually have any appetite for like tackling any of this? And I think one of the things that you can see by the activity that's going on, even though it's an interim session, is that they are interested in looking at this. They're interested in hearing from people. And then there's an appetite to do things. So last week there was a constitutional players meeting. So they brought together people from the governor's office, OPI, the Board of Public Education, the Education Committee, Education Budget Committee. They talked about a bunch of things, including a lot of the stuff that we talked about, including, you know, special education, including teacher retention, all of that. They also had the interim committee hearing. So they had the education and the budget committee hearing, all the things that we were talking about. They were also talking about, and they also had ledge days. So they brought all the legislators in. So not just the ones on the education committee that talk about this stuff a lot, but brought in all the legislators. And they had little breakout hearings or breakout meetings throughout the day. And 2 of the meetings were just about school funding. And then obviously we have the decennial study of school funding coming up. So I guess one of the things I wanted to say is rest assured that this is something that they're looking into. So everything that we're talking about is not in vain. It is something that they're paying attention to. So the first thing I wanted to go over were the notes from our first meeting. So this was posted on our website. It went around in the email and everything. But this was the notes that I pulled from the things that we discussed. So I would love to, if you haven't seen it yet, take a quick glance of things. I want to start to look at this, pull out areas where we think we want to dig in a little bit further, but then also start to refine solutions that we want to kind of outline or suggest. And while you guys are quickly glancing at that, I know there was also some, like I mentioned a minute ago, a couple of you guys asked for just some data on like special needs students in the population in Montana. Would you guys like me to pull that up first so you can kind of see that?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
So I did put some still shots of this in our share drive, but this is something you can access. It has secure data, but you can kind of look at breakdowns of different data. And I really like this because it is graphs, and I'm a visual learner, so it helps me to see things in graph form. So give it 1 second while it loads. But this will have some statistics. And just to kind of go over a couple other things, they're not shown on this graph while this graph hopefully loads. So one of the things you guys want to know is how many special education positions are open. So currently there's roughly 140. There's roughly 1,000 teacher positions open in the state of Montana. It's a little bit high going into the summer months. It usually peaks a little bit there. And that goes up and down. Some of those postings, so that's not real time, that could be a little lagged, but just so you guys have a rough estimate of the kind of teacher positions that are open in Montana. Okay, so now we can see these are kind of graphs and breakdowns of special education children counts. I think one of the questions that I saw on the shared drive was what are the disability like kind of categories and descriptions and which ones are the most prevalent? So you can see that is the bottom graph along there. So just like learning disability in general is the largest, but autism was also a large category, other health impairments, speech and language, all of that. So we can also look at the demographics, and hopefully this will load a little bit quicker. So this shows, I know something else that popped up was setting of service. So you can see the setting of service is that top right. You see with the dark green is inside a regular class 80% of the time. The age groups is only like basically broken down into like pre-K and then post pre-K in this graph. But this gives a kind of good breakdown of that. I answered a number of other questions in the shared drive. I should have checked. Someone put up a document with a ton of questions. I put in another document in there with the exact same questions copied over with the answers. But that I think answered a couple of questions that popped up. Another question I know that popped up was the inflation rate and what do other states do with the inflation rate? How do they link inflation rate? So some states tie to inflation, kind of like ours ties to inflation, but it has a cap. So for instance, like Massachusetts cap is a little bit higher than ours. It's at 4.5%, but they're having the same discussions over there too, where 4.5% is still not where inflation was at for the last 2 years. So although their cap is higher, having the same discussions as Montana. So a lot of states do tie to inflation. Some states don't at all. I believe Connecticut doesn't tie at all to inflation. So some states don't tie at all. They don't have an automatic increase. It's up to the legislature to pass that increase. So I think that hit a number of the questions that popped up. So I'm going to bring up again I'll have it in the background as we talk. Pardon me, I have so many tabs open. It's hard to find which one I am looking for. It is this one. Okay. So I just talked a ton. So I want to stop talking. I want to turn it over to you guys. Happy to go into detail on anything I talked about, any of the legislative updates or anything like that. But how are you guys feeling? What's new in your world now that school has let out? We're in summer. Thinking about our discussions from last time, what are in the top of your minds regarding the budget formula discussion and then special education needs? Jenny, I'm going to call you out because it looks like you were about to say something.
I guess just like do we feel because of inflation and the cost of everything, especially in special education, that like the current formula, even with the increase we get, is adequate, even if inflation goes down? As a special education teacher, my population has exploded over the last 2 years.
And that's
So
something we're hearing a lot, that the students that are identified as special needs and have an IEP, that number keeps increasing.
it does. And then I guess the other thing is I teach out of a large district, so I teach in a smaller district. And so we follow the co-op model.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of our funding is funneled through the co-op. And is there, ways to increase that as well? Because like, I know our co-op just had to reduce our services again this year. Like our physical therapy went from full-time to 0.4, and they've just things like that, like rural schools. And I know we put it in here, they're harder to staff, but I also think that, I mean, our co-op covers 29 schools, so or something like that. It's kind of unwieldy, and they do the very best that they can, but are we adequately, can we adequately fund that model, or should it be something different?
Michael, I saw you shake. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tamara.
One of the things that stood out to me from our meeting in May was about how the federal government can pay up to 40% of the cost of IDEA, but they generally are only paying somewhere in the 13 to 17% range. And I don't know if or what the legislature could do to put pressure on them to increase that amount, but that would seem like a source of funds that would be worth pursuing. That would help other states too, probably.
It is a slower process, but one of the things that we can request of the legislature, it's not slow for them, but once it gets to the feds, it's slow. One of the things we can request of them is to, as a formal committee, request to our federal legislators or to Congress people or to senators, to advocate and push for that. So although that's not, that solution that happens overnight, we can at least request that they continue to put the pressure and up the pressure publicly. So that is one thing, not a magic switch, but we can ask them to up the heat pressure on that.
Because basically that difference is being made up for with those local and state dollars, that because those then have to go to special ed, then they're not available for all these other things. And what's coming in for special ed isn't even adequate, as Jenny just illustrated. So,
and the other thing, and I saw you guys talked about that, I wasn't available last time, but the 3 to 5 year olds really puts like pressure on smaller schools, because usually they co-op a preschool to try to service that. So like my district is co-opt with a couple other districts to try to alleviate some of that. But a lot of those, a lot of our own district funding out of our general fund has to go to support the preschool.
yep, same here.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of those kids and as they come in, we notice those kids need more and more services and are coming with more and more severe disabilities. So. Sorry, my cat is playing with his toy.
I didn't hear it at all. And there was There was something also I wanted to share with you guys, and it was something OPI presented about to the education committee last week. And this is specifically not to change it to teacher retention, but I had this document up and let's see. It has a number of stats that specifically pull out stats for special education teachers and are issuing it's actually not just in Montana. We also had presenters that run national organizations. It's across the board, a US problem with teacher recruitment and retention. But one of the things I wanted to focus on, so the teachers that left the workforce, 12% of teachers with a special education endorsement left. Of the teachers that switched schools, 10% special education, 20%, 27% of gifted and talented. But it goes into a lot of details about the turnover rates and how bad the turnover rates are, and how bad the turnover rates, like we mentioned in the last group, it's even worse for special education teachers. But this document I did share, it's something put together by OPI staff, but it goes really a lot into what all the issues and kind of the stats behind teacher turnover, but some of the things that we've started to do in our state, but maybe need to expand a little bit. But I just thought that was interesting, some interesting stats. I always like numbers, so that's a resource for you guys, but also thought just a good talking point for us. Well, I guess it's not good, but you know what I mean, a moment for us to focus on.
We have a very hard time at my school retaining special education teachers. I've been there the longest, no, I guess our middle school teacher's been there one more year than me, and I've been there 5 years. So, I mean, it doesn't, we don't have a teacher retention in special ed is incredibly hard, and finding a teacher to fill a special ed position, especially in a smaller school or in a district. Honestly, at least our district, we're outside of Billings. We can't compete with Billings for benefits or teacher pay. So, I mean, if you can't compete, you can't compete. I mean, I know that our open position that is now being filled. We have somebody who is a regular ed teacher, but is going through the OPI program to get her special ed endorsement.
Yeah.
And that's the way that we chose to fill it. Was the only way that we could fill it, was find somebody who was willing to participate, but we didn't have any teachers who already had their special ed certificate even apply for our open position.
I don't want to bogart too much time, but I guess there's two things I want to hit on that you mentioned. One is how we keep teachers or retain teachers. Obviously, recruiting teachers is really important too, but retaining teachers equally important. And we have the largest teacher loss in the first couple years. The first 5 years is often when teachers leave the profession or switch schools. And one of the things in Montana is that and I can pull up some numbers, but our teacher pay overall isn't crazy out of the ordinary. Our starting teacher pay is what's really below average. So once the teachers kind of get beyond that 5-year hump, then our teacher pay starts to even out with people. We have some people on the higher end, but it's our starting teacher pay that's the lowest. So that's what the Teach Act was supposed to do, that passed in the last session. But actually passed the session before. It's in its third fiscal year. One of the things the legislature was talking about, why I wanted to bring it to your guys' attention, is possibly strengthening the Teach Act. And what the Teach Act is it gives equality incentive payment to schools to ensure that the starting teacher salary is at a high enough level. They get that incentive payment. Right now, it's a little bit over $3,000. And then they get that for the first 3 years of a new teacher. And they've talked about different ways to possibly strengthen and enhance that, to really focus on getting those young teachers in and incentivizing them to stay, again, through that first 5 years, which is often when they leave.
Yeah.
Michael, I've seen you shaking your head a few times, so I'm going to call you out to see if you had any thoughts, if you just wanted to echo anything what anyone said, or anything different.
I understand too. I'm a director for one of the cooperatives, so part of it's kind of understanding a lot of the things that go on there, seeing some of the same things. I think one thing we're just kind of nice with is we're finally fully staffed. Took 4.5 months, but finally got just, to get 2 positions filled as of today. So that's some good news, but it is still very rough going. And I know budgets are always concerns too, because each year it's not getting any more money, and it's makes it harder and harder each year to make ends meet to still provide the services.
Yeah. Sarah, thanks for joining us. I don't want to call you out either, but would love to see if you had any thoughts from our discussions today or last time.
Yeah, I think it's all right on the money of what everybody's concern is. One thing that I would chime in, sorry, I switched from my phone to my computer, so I was listening in before on my phone, but one of the things that I think in terms of the federal funding is there is always, I think, ongoing advocacy through all of the professional organizations in terms of connections with the federal legislators and asking for support of that. I know I'm part of a group that goes annually. I've gone the last couple of years, and we did it virtually during COVID, where both MCASE, the Administrators of Special Education, and Montana CEC group collaborate together and send a group, and we'll be heading out in a couple weeks to DC for the CELS Summit, which is specifically to lobby Congress for fully funding IDEA and issues around special education, which the whole time I've been doing it revolve around fully funding IDEA and that fiscal piece, mental health supports, and recruitment and retention. So all the same things we're talking about here. And I can tell you that we've had success in terms of having conversations, but there's really only one that has committed to pushing it. And the delay on the reauthorization of IDEA is just frustrating. Everything at that federal level is frustrating. So they know that in the inception it was fully funded at 40%, but it's a game of pointing fingers at each other. So they say, well, there's no money, we can't get it done, and then the states need to have some skin in the game, and then the states say it's not our responsibility. We'll widen the permissive levy usage, and that's how we get to the disastrous situation we're at right now, where it's falling on state and specifically local taxpayers to attempt to fund it, because it's not ever enough. So I just wanted to add that in, that is a concerted effort, and it's ongoing.
I'm a little baffled that they will tell you that the state and local paying 60%, which technically more, is not skin in the game.
Yeah, and that's they want the terms that they've told us have been that they would be more apt to consider it if it was discretionary funding, and so that's the rationale we've been given on why they don't like it and don't want to touch it. So, meaning that they don't have to fund it if they don't want to. So, I don't know. It's just frustrating, and it's frustrating at the state level because it's the same thing. The locals need skin in the game, is what they say. We advocated, I was asked to be part of a panel of co-op directors. Oh, this must have been the 19 session, where we went in and specifically advocated for an increase in co-op funding. And they didn't like the fact that all the funding for co-ops looks a little bit different and the function of the co-ops look different. We tried to explain it's based on the territory that we're serving. There's a difference between a co-op like mine that serves primarily all smaller, very spread out rural schools across 7 counties versus, I don't know, I'll use like my neighbor Prickly Pear, where they have a more concerted group of larger A and B schools. So their funding based on A and B is more than double what mine is. But yet it just becomes more expensive to serve those kids when you have to travel an hour and a half to even have access to your child, to one child in a district. That drives up the cost compared to when you can go to one location that is within 20 minutes of your central location and you can serve all the children. So just trying to explain that. And that was their answer, was that until you guys put some onus on the schools, because some of us charged assessment fees to districts and others didn't, that they didn't want to consider it. So it's definitely a finger pointing game and a level of frustration all the way around.
Well, I know it's frustrating, but don't get too frustrated. I've seen the dam break on things, but I know the IDA funding has been a discussion probably longer than any of us have been involved in education. In a previous life in a different state, I worked for a congressman over a decade ago, and I talked about IDEA funding back then. But that doesn't mean that, you know, the dam doesn't break sometimes. I've seen things languish for a decade and then all of a sudden it gets done. So all the more reason just to keep pushing and keep talking about, you know, the areas where you guys see are important and see where the need is in your community.
You know, one thing I wanted to know about, you talked about teacher retention and also teacher, you know, retaining and getting new teachers. Has the state ever thought about limiting teacher caseloads? I mean, we do it for other, you know, 5th grade has a limit, a state limit before they have to have help, things like that. I mean, it's overwhelming, especially in a small school if they don't have staff.
Yeah.
I know personally I had 52 kids on my caseload this year while we were missing staff till we filled a position. And I mean, I'm a 20-year teacher, and so I had 5 years, almost 6 in special ed, but I taught before that. I made it, but if I had been a new teacher, I would have walked away.
Yeah,
Too much.
I think in my conversations that I know of, that the conversations that have taken place is that those caps for classroom sizes fall under accreditation.
Yeah.
And I think that the fear is that, I mean, special ed's its own beast outside of just school accreditation, but what would happen if the state put a mandate of caps on there and there literally is no bodies, and then they're hamstringing districts into automatically being out of compliance? I think that they want to push for more collaboration and creativity and flexibility rather than limiting that and getting people into federal trouble, essentially.
If not caps, maybe they need to offer schools, once they reach a certain percentage of their extra funding or something, to get in there. Because I mean, most of us, I don't know about, maybe not, but I know around Billings, most of us work on a skeleton crew anyway, trying to retain paraprofessionals and things like that. So, I mean, that might be something for us to consider.
I think it's definitely worth mentioning in our work. I think what it comes back down to is that local control piece, and I think that oftentimes they're encouraged to negotiate that in, either for additional pay, because you're essentially covering somebody else's duties, or you know, I know not everybody has that same opportunity, but because it is more of a local control issue because of the local control on our state. So that piece is tough, but I do think asking for some sort of incentive to help reward the people and compensate the people for doing double and sometimes triple duty for picking up other,
I think
and
that,
it's a direct correlation to the recruitment and retention. Because
yeah,
when you're doing the job of 4 and 5 people, it only lasts so long. People would get burnt out and frustrated.
I think that any kind of, incentive, and while I agree, local control, I mean, it all goes back to A and B funding too. Like in general funding, I mean, if the school isn't adequately funded in their general fund, then they're not adequately funded to pay their special education teachers either. So,
I had two thoughts. One, I don't know exactly how to work this out, but sometimes it doesn't work out because you want to incentivize going
yeah,
up and not have an emergency trigger going down. But I was trying to think of something where it's like, oh, you hit this and it triggers this assistance. But like I said, you generally want to incentivize going up, not a trigger when you're going
yeah,
down. But it's just something we could think about.
yeah,
And then God, I just blanked on the second thing. But sorry, go ahead.
that's all I was thinking about, is just some way of helping the schools maybe to,
Oh, the other thing, I know I mentioned the Teach Act, which quality incentive payment,
yes,
which you have to have qualified teachers in the beginning. But there's been discussions of, I think this was something proposed by Lance Melton of School Boards Association. He was talking about having basically the quality educator payment. It almost turns into something else, but be higher and be automatic, kind of, instead
oh,
of having get almost for all teachers. So more of the funding for the school is tied to the teachers and not as much as weighted on the enrollment.
that would be,
Yeah, Catherine, he has a proposal for the legislative session, and it changes the funding formula, and it greatly increases the quality educator payment to put more emphasis on the educator piece. And then it also pulls less weight on the A and B, and higher base entitlement is
Right.
sort of the focus to try to equalize some things and get the money flowing in the areas that it needs to be flowing in. So anyways, it's pretty intricate what he has, but that is the gist of it, is that there is a huge emphasis and change to the quality educator payment. And so it does incentivize districts to have highly qualified educators rather than permanent subs or emergency authorizations and whatnot. I mean, everybody's desperate, so there's that. But yeah, that would be huge. The other thing that I think would be really useful, as I'm listening to us talk about this, is I think some data to present to the legislature with this report that would have as many districts as we can possibly get, that would have, I mean, we already have the student enrollment count, we have the child count for the A and B numbers, but I think it would be important to say how many, like, list out their special education staff and who's highly qualified, who's on the endorsement project or the internship. And then what their caseload number is, because that really is what's going to be telling on how staffed or understaffed. Because what happens is sometimes somebody leaves, and then a school district will go from, a lot of mine have dropped from 2 sped teachers to 1, and they continually advertise, but they don't fill them, or they just finally give up. And I just don't think that the numbers of open positions really is an accurate picture of how short we are across the state. Or like you said, the physical therapist dropping from one FTE to 0.25, or pulling back altogether and using contracted services and telehealth to meet your needs.
And
I think that
when I said there was 140 openings, that means there's 140 openings where they're actively looking to hire. So that doesn't mean that there's not a need for it, but you know, they
Right.
they don't have the bandwidth, can't afford whatever to bring on that additional teacher.
Yes.
Or the positions such as we had a middle school sped teacher who went to a different school, and in tight budget times, they just didn't fill that position. It's still a need, but it's not a position that's being looked at to be filled. So that's 140. It's probably 240 because there's some out there that districts have decided to not try to fill.
Yeah, and on that data, if we were collecting it, it might be interesting too to ask those same districts how many special education paras they hire, like how many they have on staff, and then how many if they have any open positions that are unfilled. So I think when you're looking at that, that says, okay, well, this person's serving 10 students, this person's serving 50 some students.
Right.
And they could see the discrepancies there and how those shortages have been picked up by people who have remained intact.
Yes. And maybe even a way to phrase the question, like, not just how many do you have and how many openings do you have, but how many total para positions would you have if, like, how many did there used to be that are now not even on the list? And then to take a tangent, I think it would also be interesting to look for, since we're talking caseloads for those of us in the gifted ed world. I've got 165 kids on my caseload K-12. So that's, I mean, obviously a special ed caseload and a gifted ed caseload is different type of kids, but there's still, I think the caseload for those of us who are filling gifted ed positions would be pretty eye-opening for people as well.
Well, and I know I might, let me see, I'm going to talk to our data people. I might be able to aggregate some of that data already because we do have the qualified. We would know if someone has a special education qualification, and we also know the students and what their disability category is for the schools. I just need to aggregate them together. So I should be able to ask our data people for them. And if they're not too, I think they have one report due, or not, they have a lot of reports due, but I think they have a big report due. And they should be able to aggregate that for me, or at least a rough kind of thing of what you're looking for, I think.
Yeah, and I can ask through MCASE if we can collect caseload numbers from the directors, like what their staff, how many kids each of their staff are serving.
And I mean, the other thing, I guess, you know, my school kind of wanted me to mention, or, you know, we had talked about as a district was, and I see you guys mentioned it too, was like this, you know, the adequate support for, in rural areas for severe disabilities. Like, I mean, I know we don't like to fund down or trigger funding down, but like some of those kids, I mean.
And there is some, there are some triggers where schools can get more funding if the student has severe disability where the costs go beyond a certain limit. So that we do have that in law, but there's always ways that we can look at to possibly strengthen that. So there is a trigger for that.
Well, and I think sometimes we think of severe disabilities as always being a physical disability or a mental disability, but I don't know about the other people here, but we are also seeing severe behavioral disabilities now.
Where that also ties back over to teacher retention, because in studies, obviously there's teacher pay and being able to afford to live in your community. But the number one reason listed for teachers of why they leave the teacher profession is not the pay. It's like the workplace environment. and specifically behavioral issues with like students and everything like that. So that is in the last couple years has been a huge thing for teacher retention is some of the behavioral obstacles.
Like also triggering those like districts having to hire more than they ever have for a one-on-one. So somebody is always there trained to, or having to resource to outside services, you know, that very expensive, especially for and I'm not saying it's cheap for a district like Billings or Great Falls or whatever, but especially for a small district, you know, they may not have that funding availability, and then that teacher is, you know, kind of stuck trying to provide those services without those things.
I think the other thing in special ed that is always sort of the elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about is the work and the pressure and stress and quite frankly, and a lot of times harassment that happens to special ed teachers and case managers via parents, advocates, lawyers. It's stressful. I think, you know, a classroom teacher doesn't have that same level of scrutiny of all their work and their paperwork and continually being told it's not good enough or it should have been done different. I have one district that they have in 2 years have lost 2 sped teachers. One came, you know, and this last one that just came in, made a change in districts, is very well experienced, very savvy, handled herself very well, got a lot of accolades, and still said, life's too short. I can't keep doing this. And this is really the icing on the cake that's tipping me over. So it's just really, it's really hard. And it's the reality of what we deal with in this field. And I don't know how that gets best addressed, but
Well, I think,
that's a real thing.
yeah, a lot of that is stuff that comes down from the federal level as well. Or case decisions, case law, unfortunately.
I
But
would
maybe-
agree, but I think that nobody else, I mean, all the cases I've been involved with, we've been found to where everybody did what they needed to do, everything's okay, but all of the stress and the harassment and the heartache you go through in the process of saying, we just want what's best for the kiddo. And it's
Yeah,
just, and it gets worse all the time. I think it's harder and harder.
It is. It is. I mean, that might be something we could tie to. That's why I think incentivizing sometimes for special education teachers might be, not that money makes up for your sanity or your stress, but you know, I think that, I mean, I think in an ideal world, idea would be reworked enough that it was actually reasonable, but in certain things, but you know, unfortunately, I don't know that the federal government is heading in that direction, so we'll see. But, you know, I do think for Montana, those kids and that stress, and especially those teachers, like in our district, our teachers also are our case managers. So,
yeah,
you know, and I think that's in a lot of districts. Unless you're, you know, especially with you know, the rural thing, I think when they serve those double things, that becomes very stressful and a lot of overwhelming for a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But
all the bigger schools I know of do the same. They still have, they have a traditional teaching schedule and have expected to have a big caseload as well.
So
to like kind of recap what we've kind of been going over, and I've been kind of like formulating things a little bit into buckets. And I think one of the overall kind of looking at the funding things that I've taken away from you guys, and it sounds like what you guys are looking for what we kind of talked about with the Lance Melton proposal or something along those lines, something we talked about in other groups too, of aligning more funding with the needed teachers, not with the A and B. So I see everyone's head kind of shaking with that. So that's what I kind of see as one of your guys' proposals for the looking at the funding picture overall.
Yes.
I've seen a lot of you guys talk about some of obviously you're just talking about more funding for special education overall, but looking some of the things you guys really highlighted, I like to highlight specific issues when we're looking at it, is the additional cost, of course, for rural, the harder to access. We want to try to put pressure on the feds for IDEA. Make sure we take the co-ops into account when we're looking at increasing funding. Looking at caseloads, the caseload breakdown and the pressure, but then I see that transitioning into another bucket, which I think is, again, it's crossed everything, is teacher retention, recruitment. So that caseload kind of goes over into there of how do we recruit and then retain the teachers. So the incentivizing for them to go into special education, but then making sure that the workplace environment is conducive for them to actually want to stay in that environment. So those are kind of the buckets that I'm seeing. Is there something that
I would add unfunded or underfunded mandates,
oh yeah,
things that are mandated in our state law or accreditation standards, but there's either no funding or woefully inadequate funding for them to actually happen. Gifted ed being one.
yeah.
I'm
And
sure there's
I remember
others.
you mentioned that last time too. Karen, I feel like I cut someone off from saying something else. And I know those were very kind of like broad overview buckets, but is there, I know we started narrowing it down a little bit from the last time we discussed, but what other areas are you guys seeing the biggest need or maybe the least talked about area as well? Oh, and obviously we talked about inflation too. We talked a little about the inflation cap of either tying to actual inflation or at least increasing it.
Yes.
And what about services like OT, PT, things we're required to provide, but are very costly for co-ops or speech? Although I know speech is somewhat easier to, but those I know a lot of co-ops have gone to doing, I think you guys talked about it, online services. I mean, is that something? I don't know.
I think districts in general have gone to that as well. I think in some ways we have some, it can get expensive. I think we have some cost savings though. I think it goes both ways because I think depending on how you're getting those services currently, I have districts that were contracting with the hospital and they just strictly only hone in on that medical model. And then their rates are a lot higher. So when you're doing strictly like school-based model related services, and you are moving kids through the system and making gains and exiting at an appropriate rate, then I think that helps with the overall costs. But I don't know, they are expensive. Another piece that I keep seeing more and more is just that competition that we have that we're dealing with between the school system and the budget constraints we have versus a medical model and a medical facility that can pay higher. And then OTs, PTs, and speech paths have the ability to independent contract. And so there are some problems, I think, in that whole system of really just, I don't want to say price gouging because I think everybody is absolutely worth what they want to charge. But I also think our school staff is worth what they should be able to charge too, and it doesn't work that way. But I think that becomes problematic in many ways, and in terms of like the tax piece, the TRS piece, which there's new things around that. But the school psychs are the same way, right? So some of them are offering services. Now we see it in special ed. Legally, they can't independent contract on an educator license. So I think there's some problems within that realm, but even if that's allowed, is all that's going to do is continue to jack the prices that people have to pay. And districts get backed against a wall because it is unfunded mandates. They have to provide the service and
Yep.
there's no other options. So I think that whole mix of public funds and private sector services in some cases driving costs and driving wedges between what different people make is kind of a messy waters in itself. But I think that licensing piece ties into it as well on who can independent contract and who cannot. So that's something that will need to be taken a look at.
Whole model thing creates problems for us all.
Sorry, I was just taking notes on that. That was the first time that's come up in all my discussions. Makes sense that it comes up in this group, but so looking forward to what our next groups are looking forward to. So what I want to start to do for the next one is we started to kind of formulate those buckets, and a lot of things, like I said, they all interweave with all the other groups. So I'm gonna do another like one pager like I did for the last group. But one of the things I'm going to add is a section, and I think I have relatively broad kind of proposals that you guys are going down. So I'm going to include like things we want to propose or suggest to the legislature. So more than just a summary, things we want to include in the final product. So is there anything else that you guys are thinking of where you would like more? I know we talked about aggregating the data of the caseload and stuff like that. Is there other data that you guys are looking for? I know I went over some of the questions from last time, but not all. I do think I answered or have links to answers for all of the questions that came up from last time in the shared drive. Is there any other information that you guys are looking for?
I just have a couple. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say for that last discussion we had, is there a way to find out how many schools are using telehealth instead of like the school, school-based model kind of thing?
I'm not sure, but I can ask.
Okay.
And I'd be happy to ask through MCASE too. I mean, I think we can say same thing like those what are your providers' caseload numbers? Who's using telehealth services of any kind?
And how many, I guess the other thing I would ask is how many open positions do we have for those related services or school psychologists? Because they all fall under the special education kind of umbrella too. Are they part of that 140 or is that strictly special education?
That was just special education.
Teacher.
Trying to think, I might be able to pull that up. Ooh, that might take me a minute. That's a separate category, but I know I have it because I saw that number earlier today. I just don't remember what it is, but I can easily, I can throw that in the share drive too.
Okay.
But that is a separate number.
I was just going to add too, I think, on those, as far as like moving forward, just tailing off of the same stuff I was talking about. And this may have came up already. One of the things that we need to look at, which is an ongoing topic, so I'm not worried about it, both at the federal and the state level, is just those Medicaid reimbursement rates, because that does affect our services that are billed on. And then the ability to have some flexibility in terms of staffing to be able to hire our own LCPCs, MSWs, whatever that may be. And when I was reviewing getting a highly qualified payment for those, when I was reviewing it, I think they're actually listed in there. So I need to do a little more homework on that. But those things, just to add for our group's knowledge, that those are things that'll be looked at also. And then on the data piece that you asked about anything else, I think what's equally important when we're asking about those sped positions. I think it's equally as important to find out how many districts are actually staffing gifted and talented. Because in my corner of the world, it doesn't happen. They say they do, they have the laws, they do whatever. I fight this as a parent just to have some flexibilities, let alone have an actual staff person that is focused on addressing that. So I think that would be
What-
just as important for the data piece.
What a lot of schools do is say, oh, we have an AP class, check. We have a gifted program. Well, that's not the same. That's an important piece, but
Mhm.
that's definitely not the same as the services that I provide. So yeah, I would say that that's an area that's woefully understaffed
Yeah.
and also woefully misunderstood.
Yes.
There's not enforcement from OPI because OPI is understaffed in that area. And so therefore nothing's happening. A lot of districts say they have something happening, but it's usually checking a box to placate the state, saying that they have an AP class and calling it good, when that's nowhere near the services, the full spectrum of services that the kids need. So I have two.
Oh, sorry, go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
Nope, go ahead.
No, my thing is on a different topic. So if yours is on that topic.
Well, a little bit. I don't know what made me think of this, but it was a discussion in one of the committees when they were talking about, so Montana has a lot of school districts. We have a lot of um like superintendents and there's a lot of like upper echelon people. One of the things they talked about was like possibly condensing some of the oversight of the school districts. And this was very like off the cuff when they were talking about it, but I thought it was interesting because they're talking about like sharing more of like maybe the superintendents, but then also having some of the more rural or smaller school districts share some of the specialized staff more readily as well.
Mhm.
It was
Yeah,
just
like a
something that came
GT
up.
co-op model might work similar to special ed in areas that have a sped co-op. Maybe a GT co-op could work in those areas.
Or I was also like languages. So you have a Spanish teacher in an area,
Mhm.
2 days at one school, 3 days at another school, something like that. Those were all discussions to facilitate more of those things. So doesn't tie exactly, but you inspired me because I was like, well, if you have someone who's focused on gifted and talented programs, schools could share that person.
Mhm. Yes. A couple funding ideas, or maybe, again, I don't know if these would work, but you guys are asking for creative out of the box ideas. So right now, there's a lot of school districts in the boat of cutting staff because of inflation and budgets are very, very tight. And yet we apparently, correct me if I'm wrong, have a surplus at the state. So maybe there could be some trigger, because we use that word for another setting in our conversation. Maybe there could be some trigger that sets in that, like, if inflation's at a certain point and there's a surplus, that a certain amount of that surplus has to then go to the schools. Because right now, my understanding is none of it is going to the schools. I don't know where it's going, but all of us who are in this boat are not seeing it.
Okay, sure. I don't know if I've ever heard of that before. I've heard of like when debt hits certain level triggers occur, but I haven't heard of surplus triggers. But let me see if that's ever been done with anything before. It's always good to have, I think, a model, even if it's a mini model, but it's a cool idea.
Okay. My other, I'll let you finish writing that.
I'm also recording this, so I take notes,
Okay.
but I also go back and rewatch, so you don't have to worry.
Okay. So my other idea comes about from my recent experience here. My district is one of the ones facing a significant shortfall for next year, and there were many many things done to try and mitigate that. For example, the high school art teacher retired, so they're moving the middle school art teacher into the high school position and not filling the middle school position. So that saves a teacher's salary there. One of the other things that they wanted to do was move me out of gifted and into sixth grade, filling a hole from somebody who was retiring, basically. But then that would have been the elimination of all of our gifted ed services that have been happening for not just counting me, counting the previous person who held this position 42 years of those services being provided. So I actually fundraised to keep the gifted position for next year so that those services are still in place for those students. Yes, I had mixed feelings about having to go down that route, but we were successful. But part of what I ran into, which leads me into this idea that I want to mention, was so like donating to a school district. The school district is a government entity, and so to some degree it can count as a tax write-off, but a school district isn't a 501c3. So if a school district could adopt or create an entity that's a part of the school district, that's a 501c3 portion, that people could say like, hey, I want to support the art program, so I want to donate $100 to support the art program, that they can do it in a piece of the district that's a more typical tax write-off entity. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but
Yeah,
ask me a question if I'm not.
No,
we actually looked into that, and we had to make our PTO became a 501c3 entity of their own. So then the funding went through the PTO, and then the PTO donated whatever they wanted to the school because of the laws, the tax laws governing 501c3 and school. It was weird. We also have a foundation that like you can donate to that supports students, but it's almost like what's written in the 501c3 when they create it. You have to be really careful with the wording, is what we were told, because it can cross tax lines, and there's something about being funded by tax dollars and accepting donations or something.
Correct. So
Yeah.
if there could be some way to make that easier for people, because people were very willing to donate and wanted to, but some people couldn't because of the different tax classifications. And so if there could be a way to clean that up or make it simpler, make it easier, make it more possible, I think that there would be a lot of people who would, just like every year they donate $50 to the Leukemia and Lymphoma Foundation, they would donate their $50 to support the art program at the local school district. And that may be a source of funding that, obviously it's not consistent, but it's certainly something that could help.
so I think I would call it like a stopgap measure, but stopgaps are needed. And, schools, you never know now or in the future when a school has a need for some money. And I think this speaks to also like an issue with how the levies failed. I don't think a lot of the communities felt connected to how that money was being spent. But when someone's like, I'm literally going to donate this so they have an art program, people feel more connected. It's just like, I know it sounds weird, but it's a strategy when you get people to donate. It's like your money will go to do this exact thing. And people like that. I get it. I like
Exactly.
knowing where my money's going. So
Exactly. Yes.
I think it's hard for people when they see, because not a lot of people understand how schools are funded. And like, we have a building fund. In our specific school district, our building fund, I won't say is well funded, but it's manageable. Like, we can afford to make the dire repairs that we need to. And so like, we had to do something to our middle school, and people walk by and they're like, you're asking for a general fund levy, but you're doing all this construction. They don't understand, and it's hard to educate people because they, you know, in everyday life, your pot of money is your pot of money. It doesn't have the same kind of restrictions that tax money and tax dollars do. And that's very difficult for people to understand. I mean, to them, especially people who don't have students who are in school, they drive by and they see all this work going on at the school. They just assume the school has money.
No, and that's something I've heard in other groups, but across the board, either no matter how you fell on what you thought of the levy, whether you voted for or against it, is a way that we can help educate people just on how it works, where the money comes from. No one has to be an expert, but it does help when you can have the community understand and bought in and see where the money's coming from, how it's being used, all of that. So if you find a way to magically inform all voters, please let me know.
Well, since our levy failed, we obviously did not find the magic way.
But I think that's a little bit outside of what we're doing, but I think it's important to talk about of how we all as individuals, like, 170 people signed up for this working group overall. There's a lot more people obviously that are engaged in all this stuff, and how do we as people who are engaged in this, like, help people just get a little bit more familiar, right? I'm not an expert, but I know a lot more than the average voter. But how do we have people kind of get educated and engaged and understand what's happening in their community or school district? So that's always something we can discuss, and maybe that's not a legislative fix, but maybe there's a way we can help improve that. But so you guys have been on here an hour. You've had to listen to me talk for an hour, and I don't want to extend that pain for you any longer. Let me know if there's anything else you want on this. Otherwise, stay tuned. Check out the share drive. I put a lot of stuff in the share drive for there's a lot of just data and stats and state comparisons. But I'll be working on another document. We'll keep refining and talking about things, and it intermingles with everyone, all the other groups. So let me know if there's anything else you need now. Otherwise, shoot me a note anytime and we'll just stay connected.
Can I just add one thing just off the topic of the donation piece? So there is a law. It was passed in 21 and then it was upgraded in 23, where, and I'm just reading it right here, individuals, estates, trusts, corporations, partnerships, and LLCs can all donate to public schools and get dollar-to-dollar tax credit. And it's been increased to 5 million, and it's wildly successful. Like, what happens though is they get their donors ready and then everybody files the forms, and the public school dollars went faster than any of the private school dollars. But there's a timing on it, like when that opens up and when that closes. So I don't know that they would do anything more other than continue possibly to increase the tax credit amount on that, but it is dollar for dollar tax credits, and it is specific to donate to public schools. And I believe that the donors, this was the intent in 21 when it was explained, that the donors can stipulate what they want that to go for. So like if you found donors specifically for the G&T program, that they can put that in there, and then the district earmarks it specifically for that.
Yeah,
but
my
it's a
district
matter of
created
finding
a
out
whole
those
separate.
dates.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, you're okay. I just was going to say it's a matter of finding those dates of when that window is for people to apply for that.
Okay. Yeah, I know in this case, my district created essentially a separate sub account at the bank that only these donations went into.
And who knows,
they
there
were
may
very
be weird.
specific.
I was like, there could be interesting. It's tax law, right? When we get down to it, so there could be interesting cases of why it doesn't always work the way. But I can just pull up a little bit more on that too. Sarah sounded very knowledgeable about it, but Tamara, for you, I can just check into it as well.
I think it was House Bill 403 last session. So 23, it said House Bill 403. Oh no, 408, sorry.
That bill has it's a shorter window, right, than the school year though? It's like by October.
It's a specific window when it opens, and then it's only open until that money runs out, and it runs out fast. So the first year, I think it was, I can't remember what the dollar amount was in 21, and then they increased it to $5 million last year, and it still ran out very fast, like within 24 to 48 hours, I want to say. So people get their donors together, and then they have everything ready to go. And it was really like the school business officials, I think, were working with the donors. So
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, but they still had private, yeah, we talked about that. They still have quite a bit of private school funding. They
yeah,
don't,
but this is separate. So this one is for people who want to donate to the public school programs.
So if they don't get their form turned in within
that
the
they don't
first
get,
5 million, they don't get the tax write-off for it?
Right, exactly. They would just get whatever normal deductions would be available, but there's dollar to dollar tax credits for those donors if they do it within that window and around those
Okay.
parameters. So that's something that you could talk to those donors about and potentially grow that piece and just do it
Right.
on that time frame.
Well, and
Moving
even talk
forward.
to the legislature about increasing that amount from 5 million to 25 million.
Yeah,
Uh,
so this was the second session, and it was increased and it's wildly popular. So I could see that happening again, another increase in it.
Yes. Yes. For sure. Katie, if you wouldn't mind, so I mean, technically I'm a member of Group E, but I've been participating also with Group A because it's a little bit better fit. Can you add me into the drive for this Group A? I don't know
Yes.
that I
And actually,
have that
you
link.
in the email I sent out on Friday, there will be a link to it, but I will shoot you another email directly.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, I think we have some more great stuff to go off of. I appreciate everyone taking personal time, especially in the summer, to talk to me and talk about this really important issue. So thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your night and stay cool.
Yeah,
Hot out there.
thank you so much.
Okay. Good
thanks.
night.
Hi, everybody. Thank you.
Take care,
Bye.
everyone.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you.